Yeah, I'm Misty Adame. I am a counselor for Christian Family Care Agency. I do work with a lot of foster kids, adopted kids, overseas adoptions, and then children who've been through extreme trauma or adults who've been through childhood trauma. We're going to talk a little bit at first kind of about what's normal and healthy, because then we know something, we have a place to measure it. The impacts of trauma, which is what we're going to talk about, the impacts of trauma on childhood development. Normal, healthy, we call it the circle of security. You know, it's basically we have this nice secure base, right? Parents, caregivers who love and respond to us. And we go out and we kind of explore the world, right? We see kids do that. They'll move in and out of relationship, right? In and out of proximity. We watch over them, we take joy in them, and then something happens that child needs help, right? It could be, if it's an infant, hunger, right? It could be tired, could be overstimulation. If it's a toddler, it can just be that they got too far away and they're not sure, so they're going to go back, right? They're going to return and seek out that safe base, and they're going to want to be protected and comforted, and they're going to take delight in that relationship, moving back into that proximity with the parent. So we have that's pretty normal. And then attachment takes place pretty much from minute one, day one of a child's life. They start working on development that's focused on building an attachment with people, knowing that they have that safe base to run back to. So we have what's called a relaxed state. The child's in that relaxed state, they're calm, right? And then we have a need. What's a child do when they have a need? They cry, right? They might fuss, they might get angry or mad, but they respond, right? They do something that tells the world that something's wrong for them. And then they're going to express it. So then we're going to have an intervention from our parent. In our example here, the infant cries, we come, we give them a bottle, they go back to feeling relaxed, right? They go back to that calm state, that safe place. And in doing that, we have trust, right? This is a nice, safe, trusting development. Now, for kids, this can get disrupted pretty easily. The most impactful time for domestic violence to impact a child, to live in a violent situation, whether that abuse is toward them or not, is 0 to 5. From minute 1 to 5. There's a lot of research now on neonate, you know, in utero, that if we have a distressed parent, if that parent is experiencing abuse, that child will come out and they'll show signs as though that child has been abused. They'll show those signs, that lack of trust, high anxiety, kind of a fear state from birth, not easily coddled. We also see that, of course, in addiction, right? If we have an addicted parent, that child's not in any type of safe or stable environment in the womb, and so they come out and we see those signs in the child, okay? So we're going to talk about this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I notice on your handout it didn't come out super clear, but hopefully you can get some information out of it. So in normal development, children go, well, all of us, everyone on the planet, goes through these stages of needs. And they're hierarchical in that they build, right? So my first thing that I'm going to seek out from birth is my basic needs, right? Food, air, shelter, warmth. I'm going to need those things in order to feel safe and healthy, so that then I can build onto my safety needs, which you'll notice is protection, security, law and order, the ability to understand where limits and boundaries are, okay? These needs are pretty well rooted 0 to 5, okay? So when those needs are met, we have a nice, healthy, stable foundation to build love and belonging, where we feel like we're part of a family, we can give and receive affection, we feel loved and cared about, okay? On that we build esteem needs, which is where we get that self-esteem, but it's where we get our own idea of ourselves. And then on that we have self-actualization. So this again is every human on the planet. We all need this, we all build this structure the same way. What happens that becomes really difficult for kids, especially 0 to 5, is when they live in violent upbringings or where there's a lot of abuse, neglect, okay, instability, what happens is these base foundations get fractured. And when the base foundations get fractured, you can see it's going to affect every area of that child's life, okay, as they grow. One of the things I want to point out is that for kids, when they're in an environment where there's domestic violence, where there's abuse, neglect, drug use comes into neglect, that what happens is they get not only their needs are not met, so their foundations are getting all fractured, and they're getting mixed messages, not able to gain a lot of healthy structure for their life to build this foundation, this structure, is it also affects every area of their development. It affects their neurological, it affects their social, it affects their physiological state, it affects their cognitive reasoning, it affects every area. And the most pronounced is usually their emotional states, because they lose them. They don't have them, okay? So what I'm going to talk about here is a child who, I'm going to, like I said, because 0 to 5 is the most profound, I'm going to kind of talk about that the most, but it affects everything, right? So 0 to 5, this biological and psychological needs. When a child comes out of the womb and all the way up to 5, they're going to really focus on those basic needs, especially 0 to 9 months. Basic needs is the most influential factor. But here's the thing. If I took all of us in this room, healthy, stable, well-balanced people, and I put us in a natural disaster, where are we going to drop down to? We're going to drop down to this level, right? We're not going to worry about love. We're not going to make sure we have enough hugs and kisses, We're not going to worry about whether we're overly influential in our esteem. We're going to worry about food, clothing, shelter. It's the natural instinct in us. We, by nature, by the way that God has designed us, we will do everything within our power to preserve our life. It's a natural state. It's done in our biology. We're not going to be in the face of a lion and go, oh, stop, and be really calm. We're going to run, or we're going to fight. We're going to be instinctual in it. So we're going to do whatever we can to preserve our life. And the difficulty comes in this structure when a child doesn't get these basic needs met because they're living in neglect or they're living in abuse, and they don't. The effect of abuse is that the environment is really unstable. So I'm always going to stay. You see how quickly we drop into that area of safety needs, right? Food or protection, shelter, limits. If our environment is constantly up and down, and it sounded like you talked a little bit earlier about, the Prince Charming. We usually use Prince. Sometimes it's Princess, right? But we have a Prince Charming parent who's really sweet and kind and loves and hugs on us after they beat us up, right? In particular for kids. Sometimes for kids, the difficulty is watching that happen to a parent. Because if they do that to my mom and they tell my mom they love her, and they tell me they love me, what's next, right? So kids are pretty instinctual in that. They figure that stuff out pretty quickly. Or they get hurt when they cry. So they drop cry as an emotional state, and then all they have is calm and rage. So they'll be fine, and I saw this in particular with my son. I got him at 6 months old. He would not cry. And trying to be a parent, okay, I have a plethora, this is one of my husband's new word, plethora of children, and so when I don't watch the clock, I'd never been trained to watch the clock, when the baby fusses, you check the diaper, you put a bottle in their mouth, or you rock them to sleep, and one of them works. Worked with every kid. Didn't work with him, because what would happen is if I didn't keep my eye on the clock and make sure he ate, I wouldn't let him go past 3 hours or 4 hours, because then he would scream. He would go 6, 7 hours, and then all of a sudden he couldn't handle that need anymore, and he would scream at the top of his lungs. And I'd be like, what? Oh my gosh, I haven't fed you in, forever. And so I had to watch the clock with him and feed him so that he would learn how to cry again. He would learn what that felt like. He would then fuss a little bit and he'd get cry back. But that's where we get the bipolar piece for little kids, is because that's all they have. All the other emotional states we learn by what? Reading our parent, engaging our parent. Guess where we learn empathy? Research says the only place a child could learn empathy is from a caregiver. That's the only place. From you and I engaging with that parent, that child as their parent, teaching them empathy. If they don't learn it from us, they can't learn it anywhere else. It's pretty amazing, huh?
I'm wondering, I'm thinking of the use of negligence or deprivation. Are any studies being done in terms of children at a very early age being put on some kind of given an electronic device, or their parents constantly on an electronic device, and the deprivation or neglect that can arise from that? Is there anything that's being done or studied on that?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, this is what we've known, and we've known it since video games came out in the 80s, right? With Pac-Man and all those Atari whatevers that came out in the 80s, 70s, 80s. What they know, in fact, this is where they actually learned it, was with Speed Racer. Do you guys remember, well, for some of you, remember that cartoon? That's where they actually figured it out, is if you flash color at a specific speed and a specific frequency, it affects the neural system. SpongeBob. Well, it tells you my age a little bit. Okay, but Speed Racer, what happened is when Speed Racer came out, kids were having seizures, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And what they actually found out is when they flashed the red in Speed Racer, remember he had the red on his car? When they flashed it at a certain speed, it triggered the brain into a seizure. So they started studying it way back then, because video games, what? Flash color. And video games flashing color at certain speeds or certain frequencies affects the brain, whether it goes calm, does it go into hyperarousal, does it go into a fight state, does it seize, does it create anger? And they figured it out. They know that flashing, for red in particular, at a certain speed and frequency affects the emotion state in the person. This is the other thing we know from neurological research, is that, because video games come up so much, you can tell, but is that your brain doesn't know the difference between reality, fantasy, and fiction. And we all have experienced this. Every person in the room has experienced this. Because you had a nightmare, and you wake up, and you're shaking, and you're fearful, and what are you doing? You're self-talking yourself down, right? Or you're waking up your spouse going, I had a bad dream, I need you to help comfort me, I'm having a hard time, right? I dreamt this or I dreamt that. Your body doesn't know the difference because your brain doesn't know the difference. So when you're in tuned, when you're focused in on a video screen playing a violent game, particularly violent games, your brain doesn't know the difference between what you're seeing and reality. So it takes it in as reality. So that's the difficulty. So your brain also what? Loses time. We've all done that, right? You're reading a book and you don't realize you read a book for an hour. You're watching a movie, it feels like 5 minutes, not 2 hours, right? We've all done it. The difficulty is that you don't realize that that baby has been whatever, not eaten for however many hours, and then that's where the neglect comes in for the child. The difficulty right now is video gaming at this level, where we are technologically today. We aren't going to know the effects necessarily until these kids get older, but we can project, because we know what? We know that our brains can't tell the difference. We can see the increased aggression in our society. We can, we know that it's going to affect how they think. Now, are they going to be more skilled and adaptive if they were to go into, because we know that you can use video gaming to teach somebody how to fly a plane. So if I can teach somebody how to fly a plane in a simulator, I can teach somebody how to fight in a simulator, right? So there's that part, that extrapolating it to the end state of what it's going to look like. But all we can say really right now is that we know that child's neglected often. And where we started seeing it really big, although things have changed a little bit, is in marriage relationships. Remember, I work with couples, and we had a big influx about 15 years ago where spouses were calling themselves what? Widows to the video game. Because their spouse was playing so much that they began to seek out affection and connection through another computer source to another person. So it was going both ways, male, female, but there was a neglect going on there. So you can imagine there's neglect for the kids socially, relationally. Yeah.
Misty, we're in our last couple of minutes here, but I wondered if you could address the women in Cleveland and the fact that, the one gal, when, she made the call, she got out. The other two chose to remain in that house. And I wondered if you could just address that a little bit, as well as prospects for recovery because of those different personalities of leave and exit versus stay.
Well, I can speak to it in general, and that is that one, that trauma bond, right? He didn't kill me. He showed me love and affection. He cared about me, fed me, kept me alive. I may have been, are you talking about the women that were chained to the wall? Okay. I'm just making sure, because I'm not, there's reasons I don't watch the news. But though I may have been chained to a wall and I didn't feel freedom, what? I learned to feel safe in that environment. I learned to, it's that, I started to say Munchausen's, it's not Munchausen's, that's where I can't think of it. But anyway, Stockholm Syndrome, thank you. Yeah, Stockholm Syndrome. I fall in love with my abuser because it's a neurological need. I have a need. Remember, it goes back to that trauma bond. A trauma bond is stronger and less easy, it's more difficult to break than a healthy bond. So a healthy bond's here and that's up here, okay? So that's the big piece. Keeping your, remember I said the biggest impacts for kids is that 0 to 5? But if I got really good inputs, let's say I was in, and this happens, I was in a really safe, healthy home, and then something happened, crisis happened. My dad got laid off and we became homeless or whatever, right? Is I go to here, I have all that resource to pull on, for example, for the gal who did make the phone call, get out, and she held on to those resources and was able to create a plan to get out. Recovery happens. I wouldn't be in the field I work in if I didn't believe that recovery happens. You can go back and heal that. Even rape victims, you go back and you help them walk through that responsibility piece until they can see they really did have some responsibility, but it wasn't all their fault. Or there were pieces that I could have done and would have done different, right? So healing does happen, praise God, and we can restore ourselves.
Friends, can we please show our appreciation? Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. All right, Claire, do you want to come up and talk about grace or just have me go? Okay, you've got 15.
She's going to present a little bit about elder abuse through her personal story of her. So let's please welcome Trudy.
Okay.
Rewarded, or it was just normal for them to do that. They would go to autonomy. They would feel like they were successful, all trucking on to that goal of what? Self-esteem, right? Having strong self-esteem. Which, by the way, I didn't talk about it when we were on that slide, but you know what they found is that our society continues to decline, right, in self-esteem. Our kids continue to have less and less and less self-esteem. And they did a research study because they did all that support into the schools, right? Everybody gets a reward and everybody gets praise. And well, it's not just in schools, sports, all of it, right? We did all this stuff thinking, it's that that kids are not being the winner, and that's why the decline was coming. And all of a sudden we hit this slope where self-esteem has started collapsing. What they found is when you praise a child, without, just uniformly praise a child, they actually depletes their self-esteem because their internal force becomes externally motivated instead of internally motivated. But when a child learns to be successful and they're actually able to achieve winning the award, or they're actually able to achieve potty training and they get the reward, then their self-esteem climbs. that interesting? That praise, actually, unnecessary praise, just giving a child praise to praise them, was depleting. Anyway, so toilet training, helping that child to be autonomous. And then preschool 3 to 5, initiative versus guilt. And that's where they go off, what? And they explore the world. We all see it, usually, sometimes that backs up to about 2 years old, right? Because we see those 2-year-olds, what do? They toddle off and then they turn around and they check back with their parent. Well, remember on our previous slide, that safety needs, notice how that boundary and limits is in there, right? Setting those limits. Well, if I get to 2 years old and I don't know where the limits are, one of the things you'll really see, specifically in 2 to 3-year-olds, is they'll toddle off and keep going. You ever in the store and you walk in the store and you see that little kid bolt across the store? Big indicator, because they don't know where the limits are. They don't know where the boundaries are. They're not attuned to their parents' voice, because what happens is we attune our kids to pitch and tone. They've done research on this too, that a child, they know when your tone and your pitch reach a certain point that you're serious. We all figured that out, right? About the time they get 18 and leave. But yeah, so they attune their ear to our pitch and tone. Well, if the pitch and tone is always different, I learn to ignore it instead of tuning into it, okay? So then we have school age, and you can see the rest of them there, but I'm going to stop at school age, 6 to 11, industry versus inferiority. This is that socialization at school, right? Part of setting up that social structure. Okay, so I need all these pieces in order to be successful and engaging in social engagement. So you can imagine, just from what we talked about already, if a child's experiencing abuse, experiencing neglect, from that very first stage, they're falling to the outside, right? The world's not safe. Then I'm going to, what? Present with shame and doubt. I'm going to be fearful of the world because it's not safe. I'm going to have a high need for control in my environment because nobody's setting any structure, so I've got to set it for myself. And then in my exploration, I usually feel guilty in my exploration. You'll hear kids, or at least I'll hear kids, often they'll refer to themselves as bad. I'm the bad kid, or they'll present themselves in play as what? The enemy, whoever the bad guy is. They'll go toward that dark side instead of feeling like they're good. And then they become inferior at school. And what happens, and it's really, to me it's phenomenal, I think it's another one of those gifts from God, is that they can identify when they enter a social setting who are the kids that are like them. And they will pair up, right? And often parents go, oh, I want my kid to go with the good kids. I want my child to hang out with the honor roll student. Well, if I'm the F student hanging out with the honor roll student, am I going to feel very good about myself? No. So they're not going to. Instinctively, they can pick out like-minded kids. They can find them. And what's really fun in my job is when you see the healing start and the friends shift. And then you see the healing continue and the friends shift. Because those kids that I hung out with begin to what? Irritate me. I don't like the behaviors that I see because it reminds me of my past. So they shift to the kids that are more like them. And that keeps happening until they get to a more healthy social setting. And what's scary, kind of going with what you heard earlier this morning, is that you can take a kid and you can walk them into a room full of just general people, and they can tell you, that's not a good person, that's not a good person, that's not a good person. They can tell you like that. They know who the predators are. But what does that tell you on the flip side? The predators can also walk into a room and they can tell you who's the vulnerable people in the room. And that's scary to me. Anyway, so this is that social setting. Now, remember I mentioned that it all starts 0, minute 1? Well, part of what the struggle is in the social arena is a baby's born, I wish I had both my hands, but a baby comes out the womb and we put him right here, right? From the very first minute, that child starts scanning the face of the person in front of them. And what they'll do is they're reading signs. And they did a research study that was really interesting. They had the parent only change one feature on their face. So all they did was change their eyes, the baby would cry. If they changed their eyebrows, the baby would cry. Change their face, anything in their facial expression, the baby would cry because it's reading distress in the parent. So what they built on from that research is if a parent becomes distressed, because, and we all have been there, right? Any parent in the room can say, 01, minute 1, we went into panic when that child started crying, going, what do we do, right? And, but what they found is a parent that becomes distressed consistently ends up creating fear in the child, even if there's no other trauma. Their child's never hit, the child's never neglected. On the other side, they will begin to develop symptoms as though that child is abused or neglected because their parent is in a fear state. And they can read it, so they're not regulated. They're not sure what they're doing that is making their parents scared. Or usually what they register is that my parent's scared and I don't know what to do to keep myself safe because my parent's scared. I can't see where the trouble is. So that said, what happens is they lose the ability to read affect. So then we get them in our environments, whatever environment you're in, and that child becomes hypervigilant, which means they try to, and mostly you'll see this in school or classrooms, but what you'll see is the child will start to work and somebody moves and they will look and they'll scan that person to determine if they're safe or not. In the meantime, just like all of us, what? Adrenaline, our body starts to react. We go, oh, no big deal, right? And we go back to work. And our body starts to calm. But usually for these kids, what happens is somebody else moves. And then they're going to scan that person, and then they're going to come back, and their adrenaline, they can't burn it off. And then what happens? They explode, right? Their body can't take it, so they're going to do anything to get out of that threatening environment where there's 10 other kids or 12 other people or 30 other people. And this is also why sometimes what happens with, particularly with foster and adopted kids, is parents will take them into a department store, high ceilings, broad walls, there's not an inability to see where the limits are, and what? It's too overwhelming, so then you have this child laying on the floor raging in the middle of pennies. That's a lot of fun, because I've been there. Parents are going, oh my gosh, what did she do to her kid? But they can't take it, because they can't see where the limits are to establish safety, and there's way too many people, right? Okay, so that's a little bit about the social part. I want to talk about the neurological part. So the neurological part has these 4 pieces. So one is birth to 2 sensory motor. Remember I talked about that fine and gross muscle input? We actually have 8 senses, and 2 of those are our ability. Basically, the gross muscles are skin. And we talked about what sometimes that neglect looks like, is that they can't handle touch. They don't have any ability to register what it is. But what they also can do is they become sensory seeking or sensory resistant. And for sensory seeking kids, sometimes it's not always gross muscle or fine muscle, although you will see it because they love to jump off stuff. Sometimes it's that intervestibular, which is, I tell every parent I work with, you need to have a trampoline because it gets it all and, stimulates them, and then they begin to get their need met. But where do we get that 0 to 2? Rocking, right? Well, one of the things that goes back both to that social setting is that in utero, they did a study on mothers. And we all know when we're in a grocery store behind a mother, right? How do we know? They're rocking, right? No, anybody who's ever been a mom, grandma, we all stand in the aisle rocking, right? Well, so they studied, because of adoption, to see where some of that link is. And what they found is there are no 2 women on the planet that have the same tone, affect, and body movement and heartbeat. There are no 2 women on the planet. So talk about how instinctive God is that he designed everyone individually. That's pretty phenomenal. Because, most of us, how many options do you have for rocking, right? Side to side. And some of us rock back and forth. But, how could you get, no 2 women on the planet had the same. So that baby's trying to engage with that sensory input. Or, what? They got left in the car seat. It's one of the things that makes me a little crazy. All the strollers these days. My kid, you had to carry them. You didn't have another choice. You had a hip on each side. That's what God gave you, right? So, I'm giving away my age a little bit. But yeah, so strollers, we put them in strollers, we put them in car seats, we put them in carriers, and they're not getting all that input. So they become sensory resistant. The other thing is bathing, right? They go in the water. You all see that baby that gets really fearful when they're in the water, like, whoa, this doesn't feel comfortable, or what? They love it and they begin to splash and engage with the water, right? It's a big piece of baby life. Anyway, there's a lot of different pieces to sensory motor, but that's our big neurological development in that age, is all that engagement with our parent. Lotion, changing, right? Getting swaddled. That's another piece that really comes in, is swaddling, because we've all been told, swaddle that baby up for a while, right? Wrap them up. But if you're neglecting that baby, what? Again, there's no limits. There's nothing to press against to get that gross and fine motor movement. There's nothing to press against to feel that comfort and warmth coming back at you. Pre-operational is that 2 to 7. It's where the child's taking in information. They're engaging, right? So their brain's learning. Now, if I'm in an environment where my brain is constantly learning, when dad has a beer in his hand, I'm kind of picking on dads, aren't I? Dad has a beer in his hand, that means hide. I hear that all the time. Dad's great, dad's so much fun, but as soon as he gets a beer, you leave or you hide. But they know, little kids know, right? Or, mom, whatever, Okay, and then we have concrete operational. That's usually first grade to adolescence, where they're learning and increasing accommodating information. And then pre-operational begins in adulthood. What's really interesting, and I didn't mention it in the social engagement to me, is there's new research that children, and it took us research to figure this out, that teens, up until a child reaches their teens, they are in their neural center their social center is their family, right? But as soon as they reach puberty, they shift their social center to the world, to their friends, right? We needed research to tell us that. But what they found out is that for kids who've experienced trauma, abuse, and neglect, is there's no safe haven to come back to. Because normally kids will shift that outwardly to their social center, but their parent, right? When my friends are making poor decisions, I call home and get advice, right? Well, there's no safety net to come back to, so they begin to collapse in their social state, or they don't have one. And we do see that a lot with teens who've been abused and neglected, is they isolate because they don't know what a safe social center looks like, so they shift it outward. This is where, like in a lot of gangs, right? They facilitate that through building that network of social setting. We're family. So they build that, and then that person who is abused or neglected feels safe, feels cared for, has their high need for control met because they're independent, has their I'm bad met because they're in a group that's like-minded. You see how it fits, right? I mean, from a I don't really know another word, like a predatory standpoint, I mean, that's a pretty easy thing to build, huh? Take somebody who's isolated and doesn't have a safe network and give them one. Yeah, it's easy to understand why kids get drawn into that and feel like they can't get out, because they don't know what out is, right? Yeah. It is still a need. It's an unmet need, but what happens, they have that high need for control. So because of their high need for control, they are autonomous beyond their years. And I see that a lot. I'll see a kid who's 5 that's really 21. I mean, they are totally independent. In fact, my daughter, we got her when she was 2. She could brush her hair and put herself in ponies perfectly at 2 years old. Perfect. I'm talking perfect. Not anymore. We cured her of that really quick. But she could do it. And I would look at her just blown away that she could. I mean, it's one thing to brush her hair, right? I could see her brushing her hair. But I mean, she would pull it back into a perfect pony on the back of her head at 2. It really blew my mind. So that's what happens. And then when somebody comes in and tries to take away that autonomy to an age-appropriate level, that feels fearful, and then they get what? Oppositional defiant, right? Right? That's our clinical term for the child that needs a high level of control, because that's where it's safe. And would you, in the middle of crisis, you know, a hurricane hit Arizona, but, and we all need what? We have a high need for safety, a high need for security, so we're going to be in a high need for control to keep ourselves safe. And if somebody says, oh, just trust me, just come with me, I'm gonna take care of you, are you just gonna go? And no, you're all shaking your head, no, why? You're logical, right? You have your frontal lobe, you know how to reason through it. You know that I'm a safe person and a healthy person and I'm gonna give you a house, but you still say no, right? Because I don't know you, I don't know what you're gonna do. Well, imagine if you're 0 to 5, well, really it's like 2 to 5 is when it really comes on strong. Yeah. Okay, so I am going to talk about trauma bonds a little bit because I'm going to talk about attachment, which is the hugest piece. And then I'm hoping we'll have time, well, we will have time for questions. But trauma bonds are this, simply. It's 2 people who survived a life-threatening situation together. And it's stronger even than healthy attachments. It is re-triggered simply by being back in the presence of the environment or the presence of that person. And it also comes up from memories, can re-trigger the behavior of a trauma bond, but usually it's the person and the environment are cause the biggest response. This is also where we get, right, the victim being highly attached to the predator. They don't feel safe unless they're with the predator. Why? Or the abuser. Because that person, I was in this life-threatening situation, and they did keep me alive. In the moment, I might have felt like they were going to kill me, right? Or I might have felt like, well, I would have felt like my life was threatened. But in the end, we survived it together. Siblings will do it. Right? Even if the children are not abused, they create trauma bonds together because they survive it together, or it can be with the abused parent, okay? So it can be with any of those factors for kids, but it's a connection. Now, what is the other piece of what I said? Not only do they have this attachment, but they also have this trigger that goes on. So sometimes they're, for example, playing and seem safe and doing well, and the parent comes back in and then you get this highly reactive child. Because they're going back, in their mind, they're going back into that fear state. That person being here tells me my life's being threatened, but if I hold on really tight to them, I'll survive it. So that's what goes on for them. Healthy is where, well, we know what healthy is, right? Healthy is our normal attachment. If you're a nursery worker, have you ever worked in a nursery? What do you see? Parent comes to drop off their child cries, right? The child cries, and you tell the parent, walk around the corner, that's gonna be over, even though you can see the parents crying, like they don't want to leave, oh my gosh, they're crying, right? Especially new moms. But they drop the child off, the child cries for a few moments, the parent's out of sight, and the child toddles off and plays, okay? That's a healthy thing. It's a healthy thing. That said, when the parent comes back, the child should what? Oh, joy, my parent's here, and they run and engage with the parent. That's a healthy attachment. They see the parent, they can hold them. They can hold them inside themselves, they know that they're loved. And then when they see them, they return to that state of joy, okay? Unhealthy attachments look like this. Parent comes, that shouldn't go on forever. I need to be clear, right? It should go on for a little while. The child's gonna learn what? Mom goes away and mom comes back. So they might be like, Mom, I don't want you to go, but then they toddle off and play. They don't become distressed that the parent's leaving because they've figured out that parent's coming back, right? An unhealthy attachment would look like come to the nursery and the child just walks off. They just walk in the classroom, they just walk off. not necessarily a clue that there's abuse or neglect there until you come back. When I come back, if that child either ignores me because they're angry at me because I left them, or doesn't care, oh, mom's here, let's go, and they just walk off, that's a sign, that's one of those signs of neglect somewhere in their past, right? Because if it's a foster or adopted child, it's not going to be that foster parent or adoptive parent necessarily that's caused that reaction, but they're going to be the one that's going to heal it, right, through the Lord's help. So what happens is they can become really anxious when they separate, or they push away from the parent when the parent comes back. They can be avoidant. I don't care. They really don't. They don't care, because if you leave and you never come back, I can take care of myself, right? Or somebody else will show up. I have kids tell me that, oh, somebody else will show up. I can go home with Johnny's mom. Really? Okay. Disorganized means they flip around. They'll move around between what they're holding inside. Sometimes what happens is they'll start to feel safe with that parent, but then that gets scary, because what? I'm letting down my control. I'm letting that parent in. I'm learning to trust them, and that feels really scary. So then I push them. I call it the kick in the teeth, because that's how it feels. Right? You give the hug, you get the love, and then boom, the child turns around, they kick you in the teeth, and they run off, and they don't want anything to do with you. That's that disorganized attachment coming out. So you can see how, again, it just affects everything. It's so sad, because it really affects everything. And then can you imagine, like my little 15-year-old kiddo, getting to 15 before you figure out the world is actually safe, and then trying to figure out how to live in a safe world, when for 15 years you've lived in a not safe world. I mean, what you realize is you don't fit, right? Because you're the kid that doesn't get it. You're the kid, they oftentimes, and this is even littler, you feel like everybody picks on you. If a fight happens, it's your fault. Even if that kid walked up and hit you, it's your fault. And they really believe that. They really feel that. And anytime correction comes or instruction comes, they feel like, see, I'm the bad kid. My mom, and kids will tell you this, my dad wouldn't hit me if I was a good kid. Moms wouldn't, right? The wife says, it's all my fault that he hit me. I hear it a lot. And they'll say, yeah, my dad used to hit me all the time too, and I'd mess up with him too. Because it becomes generational. Oftentimes it's generational. I think it's harder to stop that cycle than it is. I mean, it's natural to maintain it, right? Because the predator walks in the room and he knows who that vulnerable woman is, or vice versa. I'm really picking on guys today. Okay, so we're going to continue with attachment styles. So their attachment is developed in these 4 quadrants, right? Remember, we go all the way back to that Maslow's self-esteem and self-worth and who I am. So that first one is, I'm worthy of being loved, that I believe that. The second is that I'm capable of getting my love needs met. On the other, in relationship to other people, is are other people reliable and trustworthy, and are others accessible, and will they respond to my needs? So am I going to, if I fall down and get hurt, is anybody going to care? Okay? So what happens, one of the ways that you can kind of look at how this happens is if they have a positive self, so they feel like they're worthy of being loved, but they have a negative belief that other people will care, that they matter to the world, they'll fall into that avoidant lifestyle, right? Because I love myself, I'm good, I know I'm good, I don't care about anybody else, I don't need anybody else. So they don't care if you move in and out of their life. Because you're not trustworthy anyway. The other is they have a negative self-dimension, but a positive view of others. So they don't feel like they're valuable, which is so sad to me, right? I mean, if nothing else, they were created with intention and purpose in the image of God. If they knew nothing else, they'd know they were valuable, right? But they don't feel like they're valuable, they don't feel like they can be loved, so they're going to seek out connection with others, and then they become ambivalent because that becomes uncomfortable, right? Ambivalent is when they move in and then you get the kick in the teeth, right? Because they can't handle it, they can't take it, they don't know what to do with it. And then if I have a negative view of myself, I'm not worthy, and a negative view of others, nobody cares, I get the disorganized lifestyle, disorganized attachment style. And that's really, the hardest to treat. Clinically, it's the hardest to treat. And it's also the hardest, it's the most dangerous. Because can you imagine, even in good, it all looks bad. Even if I get an A on my math test, she didn't know it was my paper, right, or whatever. It's just the whole world's bad, I'm bad, living in a bad world, and there's no hope there. And of all things, we can't lose hope, right? So I want to talk a little bit, just real quickly, about repair and how that can happen. Because the truth is that we do heal, we can heal. You can take, I talked about adults who didn't get their needs met. I find it really phenomenal. My husband and I are marriage and family ministers at the Community Church of Joy in the West Valley, and we've worked with so many couples. And it's so cool that even though we can experience horrific childhood, God can bring us into a relationship with another person through marriage, and that marriage is intended to create healing. And that's just fabulous to me. And I have had a client whose wife rocked him. And, it was tough to convince them to do that. But once he did it, he realized that he really had a need there to be held by his wife, to be nurtured by his wife. And his wife was the one that created the healing from all the neglect from his mother. We don't want to be their moms, but, God has an intention. When he brings two people together, it has purpose. And often that purpose is for healing. So the cycle of repair is we have this safe, secure base now in that child's life, but they're all broken and fractured, right? They have all these false beliefs. So we get this behavior that means that they need something, but they don't really know how to get it, or they try to get it in a way that's inappropriate. So then they don't know how they're feeling and they don't know what to do, and oftentimes they're in that state where they're overstimulated beyond what their system can take, and then you have a tantruming child. And I ask almost every training I do, I ask this: how many of you have not, raise your hand, if you have not tantrumed as an adult? And nobody, which is the normal response. Occasionally you have a brave soul that's like, oh, not me, but no, we all have. It's normal, right? We tantrum, we slam the cabinet, we slam the door, we kick the dog, right? You didn't really kick the dog, but, right? But we tantrum, and that's usually what happens, is they will tantrum because their system can't reason through it. So they can't figure out how to meet the need, so then they become collapsed, they don't know what to do with those feelings, but they can use you to become that regulator, to become that place where healing can begin, where they can see. I find the most effective thing with kids who've been through these kinds of crises is to give them an opportunity to do it over. Teach their brain to do it right. And then they know what? They know what the right thing is to do. When they can, they will. And instead of getting a consequence for not knowing what to do when nobody taught them anyway, is they get a response that they did it right, and they get the reward, right? Good job, or they get the cookie because they asked, right? So giving them the opportunity, just do it over. Do you need a do-over? And I'll let kids do it over a lot of times, because usually I give them 3 do-overs, because especially in the beginning, they don't have any clue that what they're doing is right. And when they do it successfully, they begin to ask for the opportunity to do it over. And then they no longer need the do-over. And what? There's no consequence for good behavior, right? There's not a consequence for doing it right. So when I do it right, I get to experience what success feels like, okay? Or they get hurt when they cry. So they drop cry as an emotional state, and then all they have is calm and rage. So they'll be fine, and I saw this in particular with my son. I got him at 6 months old. He would not cry. And trying to be a parent, okay, I have a plethora, this is one of my husband's new word, plethora of children. And so when I don't watch the clock, you know, I'd never been trained to watch the clock. When the baby fusses, you check the diaper, you put a bottle in their mouth, or you rock them to sleep, and one of them works. Worked with every kid. Didn't work with him, because what would happen is if I didn't keep my eye on the clock and make sure he ate, I wouldn't let him go past 3 hours or 4 hours, because then he would scream. He would go 6, 7 hours, and then all of a sudden he couldn't handle that need anymore, and he would scream at the top of his lungs. And I'd be like, what, oh my gosh, like I haven't fed you in, you know, forever. And so I had to watch the clock with him and feed him so that he would learn how to cry again. He would learn what that felt like. He would then fuss a little bit and he'd get cry back. But that's where we get the bipolar piece for little kids, is because that's all they have. All the other emotional states we learn by what? Reading our parent, engaging our parent. Guess where we learn empathy? Research says the only place a child could learn empathy is from a caregiver. That's the only place. From you and I engaging with that parent, that child as their parent, teaching them empathy. If they don't learn it from us, they can't learn it anywhere else. It's pretty amazing, huh? This is what we've known, and we've known it since video games came out in the 80s, right? With Pac-Man and all those Atari whatevers that came out in the 80s, 70s, 80s. What they know, in fact, this is where they actually learned it, was with Speed Racer. Do you guys remember, well, for some of you, remember that cartoon? That's where they actually figured it out, is if you flash color at a specific speed and a specific frequency, it affects the neural system. SpongeBob. Well, I told you my age a little bit. Okay, so, but Speed Racer, what happened is when Speed Racer came out, kids were having seizures, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And what they actually found out is when they flashed the red in Speed Racer, remember he had the red on his car? When they flashed it at a certain speed, it triggered the brain into a seizure. So they started studying it way back then, because video games, what? Flash color. And video games flashing color at certain speeds or certain frequencies affects the brain, whether it goes calm, does it go into hyperarousal, does it go into a fight state, does it seize, does it create anger? And they figured it out. They know that flashing, for red in particular, at a certain speed and frequency affects the emotion state in the person. This is the other thing we know from neurological research, is that, because video games come up so much, you can tell, but is that your brain doesn't know the difference between reality, fantasy, and fiction. And we all have experiences. Every person in the room has experiences. Because you had a nightmare, and you wake up, and you're shaking, and you're fearful, and what are you doing? You're self-talking yourself down, right? Or you're waking up your spouse going, I had a bad dream, I need you to help comfort me, I'm having a hard time, right? I dreamt this or I dreamt that. Your body doesn't know the difference because your brain doesn't know the difference. So when you're in tuned, when you're focused in on a video screen playing a violent game, particularly violent games, your brain doesn't know the difference between what you're seeing and reality. So it takes it in as reality. So that's the difficulty. So your brain also what? Loses time. We've all done that, right? You're reading a book and you don't realize you read a book for an hour. You're watching a movie, it feels like 5 minutes, not 2 hours, right? We've all done it. The difficulty is that you don't realize that that baby has been whatever, not eaten for however many hours, and then that's where the neglect comes in for the child. The difficulty right now is video gaming at this level, where we are technologically today, we aren't going to know the effects necessarily until these kids get older, but we can project, because we know what? We know that our brains can't tell the difference. We can see the increased aggression in our society. We can, we know that it's going to affect how they think. Now, are they going to be more skilled and adaptive if they were to go into, because we know that you can use video gaming to teach somebody how to fly a plane. So if I can teach somebody how to fly a plane in a simulator, I can teach somebody how to fight in a simulator, right? So there's that part, that extrapolating it to the end state of what it's going to look like. But all we can say really right now is that we know that child's neglected often. And where we started seeing it really big, although things have changed a little bit, is in marriage relationships. Remember, I work with couples, and we had a big influx about 15 years ago where spouses were calling themselves what? Widows to the video game. Because their spouse was playing so much that they began to seek out affection and connection through another computer source to another person. So it was going both ways, male, female, but there was a neglect going on there. So you can imagine there's neglect for the kids socially, relationally. Yeah.
Misty, we're in our last couple of minutes here, but I wondered if you could address the women in Cleveland and the fact that, the one gal, when, she made the call, she got out. The other two chose to remain in that house. And I wondered if you could just address that a little bit, as well as prospects for recovery because of those different personalities of leave and exit versus stay.
Well, I can speak to it in general, and that is this, is that one, that trauma bond, right? He didn't kill me. He showed me love and affection. He cared about me, fed me, kept me alive. I may have been, are you talking about the women that were chained to the wall? Okay. I'm just making sure because I'm not, there's reasons I don't watch the news. But though I may have been chained to a wall and I didn't feel freedom, what? I learned to feel safe in that environment. I learned to, it's that, I started to say Munchausen's, it's not Munchausen's, that's where I can't think of it. But anyway, Stockholm Syndrome, thank you. Yeah, Stockholm Syndrome. I fall in love with my abuser because it's a neurological need. I have a need. Remember, it goes back to that trauma bond. A trauma bond is stronger and less easy, it's more difficult to break than a healthy bond. So a healthy bond's here and that's up here, okay? So that's the big piece. Keeping your, remember I said the biggest impacts for kids is that 0 to 5? But if I got really good inputs, let's say I was in, and this happens, I was in a really safe, healthy home, and then something happened, crisis happened. My dad got laid off and we became homeless or whatever, right? Is I go to here, I have all that resource to pull on, for example, for the gal who did make the phone call, get out, and she held on to those resources and was able to create plan to get out. Recovery happens. I wouldn't be in the field I work in if I didn't believe that recovery happens. You can go back and heal that. Even rape victims, you go back and you help them walk through that responsibility piece until they can see they really did have some responsibility, but it wasn't all their fault. Or there were pieces that I could have done and would have done different, right? So healing does happen, praise God, and we can restore ourselves.